Okay, so how does your body compensate? Miraculously. Your body compensates miraculously. Um, your body just wants to live. It wants to be in a state of health, and it works really hard to achieve that even when the chips are down, even when your tissue is damaged. It's got all these ways of keeping you going, which is pretty amazing. So let's talk about that. So compensatory mechanisms for emphysema include a change in signaling. So in healthy tissue and a non-diseased person, the CO2 levels in our blood are what kick off our respiration. So your body has some gauges in your carotid arteries and some back in your medulla oblongata, which is just this part of your central nervous system in the back of your head and neck. And they monitor the carbon dioxide levels in that, and then that signals like, hey, we got to breathe here. We need some more oxygen. We have too much carbon dioxide. So as we have talked about, we lose our elasticity in our alveoli to expel the carbon dioxide out in exhale. So it accumulates in there. So we have significantly higher levels of carbon dioxide if we're suffering from emphysema. So this signaling wouldn't work anymore, because that would mean that we'd just be constantly hyperventilating, trying to expel, and what would happen is we'd just probably be accumulating more waste product. So we have to change our signaling mechanism. So the body switches over miraculously to an oxygen signaling systems for respirations, and it uses low levels of oxygen to signal respiration. And oftentimes we see people in mid to late stages of emphysema with oxygen therapy, and maybe you see them wearing a nasal cannula, which is that tube that comes around the nose and behind the ears, and they're carrying an oxygen tank. It's important that they don't crank up their oxygen level on their oxygen tank, and that's been prescribed by a doctor to be about typically 2 liters per minute of oxygen. Because if they drive up that level too high, they'll shut down their newly acquired signaling response to breathe. So it's counterintuitive. We would think richer oxygen levels and more of it would be a solution for people suffering from hypoxia-related problems associated with emphysema. But in this case, you have to still let those oxygen levels dip in order to signal breathing. Another system that we have in our body is a buffer system. For people who enjoy chemistry, this is kind of what that looks like as we go back and forth in this equation to achieve homeostasis in our body. People with emphysema accumulate the carbon dioxide, and their whole pH in their body becomes acidic. So the range of pH for health is very, very narrow in human beings, which is why we have this buffer system, and it's constantly engaged. But if we have emphysema, things tend to tip this way. We have too much carbon dioxide collecting, and so the blood becomes more acidic, and we can't expel that carbon dioxide through breathing anymore, because this mechanism is now not functioning like it should be. So the body is able to expel the excess hydrogen ions through the urine. So they'll be taken up in the kidneys and these little filtration systems and tubule system, and it'll draw up that excess hydrogen that's a byproduct of this problem and send it out in our urine. So that's another amazing buffer system. That could be a whole video sequence in itself. It's amazing. So like I said, the CO2 accumulates in here and it drives the pH down, right? Or the acidity levels up. Sorry, that looks like chicken scratch, but you get the idea. Anyway, and then one of the last compensatory measures of the body puts in place is vasoconstriction. So vaso is just a fancy word for vessel, and constriction obviously means to tighten or constrict. So it works okay, but it's not going to work great in the long term, and as the disease progresses, it can have deleterious consequences. So I've drawn the lung down here again, and then I've not included the heart. Sorry, again, it's kind of messy, but here we have the right atrium and the left atrium up above, and the right ventricle and the left ventricle down below. So this right ventricle, it's like a chamber that has a strong muscle, and its whole design is to shoot blood off away from the heart into the lungs, and those by way of the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary arteries. And then that gets sent out around those. Remember, we talked about those capillary beds around the alveoli and how vascular that was. Well, that's what these get smaller and smaller and wrap around these alveoli for that gas exchange. But we talked about how they became damaged. All the little walls degraded and they became more blobbish. So the body is also really efficient. It doesn't want to direct things that aren't achieving their end, right? So these blood vessels want to pick up gas and they want to drop off carbon dioxide. So maybe they're traveling down here and they've encountered, of course they don't see, but they've encountered this poorly oxygenated area here. So they're like, well, I'm going to pinch off that vessel. I'm not getting anything there. And maybe they're sending over here and we see another one that's kind of degraded. And here over on this side, we have some alveolar sacs that are degraded as well. The tissue is kind of kaput. Maybe shut that one, constrict that a little bit and that a little bit so that we can re-divert the blood down to areas that are working. So it's going to send it like this, down this one. Maybe cut off those two and choose that one because it's actually getting, gas exchanges happening in there the most efficiently out of all those other areas. So that's great short term because you're able to pick up more oxygen, but what happens there, it's kind of like when we have a garden hose and we turn it on at the spigot and it's running pretty good and it's falling out, maybe the end of the hose like a foot or so just falling onto the ground. But if we take our thumb and we put it over the end of that hose, now we're shooting that water, 5, 6, 7 feet like that because we've decreased the radius of the hose and we've increased the pressure. So when we do vasoconstrict here and we make that smaller and we increase that pressure, we're causing pressure to back up, and it's going to back up all the way back down into this right ventricle, and it can lead to right-sided heart failure. So again, short term is good, long term is disastrous for vasoconstriction. Okay. So treatment for emphysema will include, well, probably the first recommendation any healthcare provider is going to make to you is that you stop smoking or get yourself out of a situation where you're encountering those lung irritants. So smoking cessation will not reverse the disease, but it will slow the progression of the disease. Weight management will be encouraged. If a person was highly overweight, their body would just have to work harder, so that oxygen would have to be doled out to more space, right? So if we can keep the weight under control, then our body systems can work more efficiently. And then of course we are what we eat. It's really important that we're eating good food to maintain a state of health. If we're eating a bunch of junk, that doesn't serve us, it doesn't serve our tissues. And then activity is encouraged to keep the tissue that's available there in good working order, and a sedentary lifestyle can lead to compromising your weight management and so on. Plus, when we move our bodies, we feel better. And then drugs that would be recommended would be things that would open airways, such as bronchodilators, things that would loosen up the mucus so that we can clear that more easily. Remember that all of this is kind of slowed down, it's not working like it should, and we don't want fluid to collect in spaces that should be used for gas exchange. So we want to keep those secretions loose, and your healthcare provider will also encourage you to stay well hydrated to keep these loose as well. And then this whole thing kickstarted with an ongoing inflammatory response. So you'll be prescribed drugs that will kind of dial down your inflammatory response, like corticosteroids, or what have you. And then it's not uncommon that a person with emphysema is on a day-to-day dose of antibiotics, and that helps protect them from things like pneumonia because they will be immune compromised. They're just not as strong or able to fight off respiratory diseases especially. So there's an ongoing course of antibiotics given, and some people report feeling therapeutic effects of the day-to-day antibiotic treatment. And then we would also get drugs, we'd be encouraged to do things like get our flu vaccine, and that helps aid our immune system. We don't want to, if we were exposed to the flu, of course our body would kick into that inflammatory immune response, and that's just going to exacerbate the whole thing. So if we can just not get influenza, that's ideal. So you'll be encouraged to stay on top of your vaccines. That's it. I'm thankful to all the people that I've learned these things from over time. Great resources, smart people that I'm surrounded by, and I hope you were able to pick up some important information or helpful information today, and I look forward to sharing more knowledge with you in the future. All right, thanks.